The phone buzzed once short, sharp, like a warning. I was sitting by the window with a cup of lukewarm tea when it came through. Bryce's name lit up the screen. I thought maybe it was a mistake, some administrative notice about the estate or his father's memorial fund. But no, it was brief, final. "You're not family, you can't come on our cruise." I read it twice, then a third time, waiting for my eyes to lie to me. But the words didn't change. They hung there cold, deliberate, and cruel. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I'd buried Arthur with grace, managed his pain, cared for his home. Yet in one line, 10 years of loyalty vanished, erased like dust brushed off polished wood. My hand trembled as I set the phone down. The message didn't just sting. It split something inside me wide open. It's strange how a few words can end a decade of devotion. One moment, I was sipping tea in quiet routine. The next, I was staring at proof that my place in Arthur's world had been an illusion. That message wasn't anger, it was dismissal. Bryce and Cora had decided who mattered, and I wasn't on their list. They spoke with the confidence of people who believed money and blood made them untouchable. I sat there for a long while, the sound of the clock filling the room, my reflection ghosted in the window. "How did it come to this?" I whispered. "How did a widow become a stranger in her own home?" That question burned, steady and unforgiving. And in its flame, my sorrow began to change shape. It wasn't grief anymore. It was resolve wearing the mask of calm. Have you ever been pushed aside by the very people you once called family? Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if a message like that appeared on your screen? Because when it happened to me, I didn't drown in tears. I started to breathe differently. If a message like that ever landed on your phone, would you even recognize it for what it was? Subscribe now, because next time, the warning might come too late. And if you still won't, tell me below why risk missing the next lesson. That text didn't just cancel a trip. It ended my silence. Bryce and Cora believed I'd fade into the wallpaper of the life they'd stolen. They forgot that I was the one who kept their father's house running, and that I knew every secret he ever tried to hide. It began with that message. It would end with my revenge. They say life slows down after 50, but mine began again at 55. Arthur wasn't my first husband, but he was the first to make me believe love could still feel safe. My first marriage had ended in silence, the kind that fills a house until even laughter sounds borrowed. But Arthur's presence carried something steadier. He was tall, silver-haired, always smelling faintly of cedar and coffee, the kind of man who spoke softly, yet filled every room he entered. We met at a charity dinner in downtown Savannah. He'd just gone through a divorce. I'd just gone through a decade of loneliness. By dessert, we were already finishing each other's sentences. When he proposed 6 months later on a quiet beach, I didn't feel like I was starting over. I felt like I was finally arriving home. He gave me a ring with a small emerald, nothing extravagant, and said, "It's not about the size, Elara, it's about what lasts." I believed him. For a time, that belief was enough. He moved me into his large house on the corner of Whitaker Street, the kind of home that had seen old money, hurricanes, and generations of gossip. It was filled with soft rugs, family portraits, and the scent of lemon polish. Every corner looked like security. Every morning felt like the start of something solid. I thought the storm had already passed in my life. I didn't know the wind was just beginning to turn. Those early years with Arthur felt like living inside a quiet rhythm, predictable, but in the best possible way. He rose before sunrise, always the first to open the curtains and let the morning in. The man could turn the simplest breakfast into a ceremony. Black coffee, newspaper, folded neatly beside the plate, and a kiss on my forehead before he left for the office. Every Friday night, we'd walk to a little seafood place 2 blocks from the square. The waiter never asked for our order. He already knew it: grilled shrimp for Arthur, crab cakes for me. Sundays were for crossword puzzles and soft jazz echoing through the living room. It wasn't passion that defined us, it was peace. And after a life of noise and struggle, peace felt like luxury. Sometimes I'd watch him from the porch, talking to neighbors or pruning the roses, and think, this is what safety looks like. He treated me with courtesy, the old-fashioned kind that comes from habit, not performance. When people saw us together, they called us the steady pair. And for a long time, that title fit perfectly. But comfort, I would learn, can be dangerous. It teaches you to stop asking questions. It makes you believe that kindness is permanent, that people don't change once they've settled into routine. Looking back, there were small things that didn't fit a glance that lingered too long on an unopened envelope, a phone call that ended the moment I entered the room. But I brushed it aside. Why wouldn't I? We had built something that looked like forever. For a woman who had spent years waiting for peace, I clung to it like salvation. It started small, so small that at first, I thought I was imagining it. Arthur's laughter grew shorter, his dinners quieter. The man who once planned our summer getaways now spent hours alone in his study, door half closed, phone pressed to his ear. He called it fatigue. The doctor called it age. But I knew better. There was something in his eyes, a kind of distance that words couldn't cross anymore. When I'd ask if he was all right, he'd smile, the kind of smile that hides more than it reveals, and say, "Just tired, Elara. Nothing to worry about." So, I didn't. Not enough, anyway. I told myself that love means trust, and trust means silence. But silence can be the softest kind of warning, the kind you don't hear until it's too late. One evening, as the sunset slipped through the lace curtains, Arthur reached across the table and squeezed my hand. His palm felt colder than usual. "You've made this house feel alive again," he said. "I don't know how I ever managed before you." It was such a simple sentence, but that night, when I looked at him, I noticed the tremor in his hand, the way his eyes avoided mine. That's when I felt the first crack. Not loud, not visible, but real. I thought peace was permanent. I was wrong. Arthur began to change in ways I couldn't name. It wasn't sudden, it was quiet, steady, like a tide that pulled back inch by inch. The man who once filled the house with conversation now spent long stretches in his study. His meals grew smaller, his nights longer. Sometimes I'd find him sitting in the dark, papers spread before him, the faint glow of his desk lamp resting on his thinning hair. He brushed it off as exhaustion. "Age catches us all, sweetheart," he'd say, forcing a smile that looked borrowed. But there was more. Phone calls that ended when I entered the room. Folders that vanished from the table when I reached for them. A stiffness in his tone whenever I asked about the business. The laughter that used to fill our Fridays disappeared first. Then the music on Sunday mornings. Then, little by little, the feeling that I still knew him. Sometimes I'd watch him from the doorway, shoulders hunched, pen tapping against the same page for minutes at a time, and I'd wonder what secret thought had taken root in his mind. I wanted to ask. I didn't. Because love by then had turned into something else, a kind of fragile peace that depended on pretending not to see. I told myself it was just age, just stress, just the weight of years. But in my heart, I knew something was shifting. And once something begins to shift, it rarely stops. It began with weekend visits, polite, convenient, and perfectly timed. Bryce drove down from Atlanta every other Friday, his car always gleaming, his tone always formal. Cora followed soon after, gliding through the house as if she still owned it. They were courteous in the way strangers are, every smile rehearsed, every question sharpened just enough to cut. "Father, are you taking your medication correctly? Has Elara been keeping track of your schedule?" They never said anything directly, but the meaning lingered between words. I wasn't a partner anymore. I was a caretaker under quiet inspection. They watched how I organized the mail, how I poured Arthur's pills, how I arranged the dinner table. Every movement felt graded, like I was being evaluated for a role I hadn't auditioned for. When they spoke to me, they used my name with precision. Elara. Never Mom, never stepmom, not even Mrs. Whitmore. Just Elara, clipped and distant, a title stripped of affection. Arthur noticed, but he said nothing. He'd sit at the head of the table, eyes darting between his children and me, as if unsure which side he should protect. I wanted him to speak up to remind them that I wasn't a guest in his life, but he stayed silent. After dinner, Bryce would linger with him in the study. I'd hear the low murmur of their voices through the walls, words like accounts, documents, adjustments. When I entered, their conversation would stop. I started staying upstairs when Bryce visited. It was easier than pretending the warmth still existed. They came smiling, bearing concern, pretending to care. But I could feel it, a slow, deliberate erasure of my place in that house. And Arthur, caught between guilt and loyalty, let it happen. The night I saw the briefcase, I understood everything. It was a Saturday evening. The house smelled of roasted herbs and old paper. Arthur had fallen asleep in his armchair, the TV humming softly in the background. Bryce's briefcase sat by the study door, half open, its leather worn from years of courtroom battles. I hadn't meant to look, curiosity wasn't my habit. But when a gust from the open window flipped the top flap aside, a corner of a document peeked through. I could see Arthur's signature, faint but familiar, and Bryce's initials neatly printed beside it. The words I caught made my stomach tighten: revocable, trustee, beneficiary. Bryce walked in moments later, his tone casual, his eyes sharp. "I think we'll call it a night, Elara. Long day tomorrow." He closed the briefcase with a click that sounded too final. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed the sight of those papers over and over, the ink, the signatures, the way Arthur's name looked smaller than Bryce's. When I asked Arthur about it the next morning, he smiled without meeting my eyes. "Bryce is helping tidy up the estate, nothing complicated." His voice was gentle, but his hand trembled as he reached for his coffee. From that moment, I began to listen differently to every phone call, every hushed word between father and son. They thought I was too polite to question them, too grateful to push back. But politeness can hide sharper instincts than they ever imagined. That's when I realized the papers in Bryce's briefcase weren't just business. They were the blueprint for my downfall. Bryce began visiting more often after that night. He carried his briefcase like a badge of power, always filled with documents that never quite seemed finished. Arthur trusted him perhaps too much. "Just some small adjustments," Bryce would say, laying out papers across the desk. "Tax language, procedural updates, you know how laws change." Arthur would nod, grateful for his son's involvement. I'd bring coffee and sit quietly by the window, pretending not to notice the numbers and clauses filling the pages between them. Bryce spoke in a language designed to exclude. Words like revocable, limited executor authority, asset conversion. I recognized none of them, only the rhythm of persuasion. Once, when Arthur left the room, I glanced at a page. My name was there, buried between paragraphs, followed by words I didn't like: modified terms, revised beneficiary, transfer of interest. I asked about it later, gently. Arthur smiled the same way he did when he wanted to end a discussion. "Bryce is just protecting everyone. Don't worry, darling, you're well taken care of." But his tone wasn't steady anymore. It carried something else: hesitation. That night, I sat on the porch, the air warm against my skin, thinking about how easily trust can be written away with a few strokes of a pen. I didn't know it yet, but those papers weren't protecting me. They were preparing to erase me. A week later, Bryce arrived again, this time with a folder marked "Final Revision." He moved through the house like a man who already owned it, his footsteps confident, his words wrapped in calm authority. Arthur followed him into the study, slower now, his hand gripping the doorframe for balance. I made tea, waiting for the familiar hum of their voices, but what came through the wall that afternoon didn't sound like routine. Bryce's tone was firmer, sharper, the kind of voice used to close deals, not comfort fathers. I heard Arthur sigh. "Are you sure this is necessary, son?" Bryce answered quickly. "Completely. It's simpler this way. Less confusion later on." Less confusion. Those two words would haunt me. When I entered with the tea, they stopped talking. Bryce smiled, but his eyes didn't match the gesture. He stacked the papers quickly and said, "Just finishing some estate cleanup, Elara. Nothing urgent." Arthur looked up at me, tired, pale, older than I'd ever seen him. "He says this will make things easier for you." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that a son would never use his father's weakness for gain. But something in me hesitated. I'd seen that same tone before years ago, in my first marriage, when promises were made with smiles that didn't reach the eyes. That evening, Arthur showed me one document. He pointed to a paragraph and said, "This means you can live here for as long as you like." The phrase he used was life estate. It sounded noble, permanent, like protection. But what it meant, I would later discover, was dependence. I could stay in the house, yes, but without authority, without income, without control. It wasn't security. It was confinement, disguised as care. And with every new signature Arthur placed on those pages, I felt a piece of my future quietly slide out of reach. Over the next few weeks, the paperwork multiplied. Bryce called it streamlining, a word he used often too often. Every signature Arthur gave seemed to make him smaller, his confidence thinning with each page. One evening, I walked into the study just as Bryce was tucking a set of documents into his leather folder. Arthur looked drained, his shoulders slumped. He didn't even look up when Bryce left. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I asked softly. He rubbed his temples. "Just a lot to think about. Bryce says it's all standard procedure." Standard. Another dangerous word. That night, he went to bed early, leaving his reading glasses on the desk. I saw the outline of his name printed at the bottom of a contract. The ink was still wet. Something inside me tightened. I didn't need to read the words to know what they meant. I could feel the shift, like the house itself had exhaled in defeat. When I tried to bring it up the next morning, Arthur kissed my forehead and said, "Elara, please, don't worry your head about it. Everything's under control." Under control. His voice wavered when he said it. That day, for the first time in years, I didn't feel at home in that house. Every portrait on the wall, his late wife, the children as toddlers, seemed to watch me like I was trespassing. I didn't know it yet, but by then, the trust Arthur had promised me no longer existed. Bryce had replaced it with something he could control completely. The protection I'd once felt was gone, not taken with violence, but stolen through paperwork and persuasion. Do you think blood should always come before marriage? Comment yes if you agree, or no if loyalty means more. That afternoon, Bryce returned with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He handed Arthur a pen, patted his shoulder and said, "This is the last one, Dad." Arthur signed the papers, and with one signature, my safety disappeared. The morning Arthur died, the house was unusually quiet. No footsteps, no soft hum of his radio, no rustle of newspaper pages, just silence. I found him in his chair by the window, the early light resting across his face. His glasses were still balanced on the bridge of his nose, his fingers curled gently around a folded newspaper. For a moment I thought he was just dozing. He always did that after breakfast. But when I touched his shoulder, he didn't stir. His hand was cold, and his chest no longer lifted with breath. There was no drama, no sound, just a stillness that seemed too calm for what it meant. I called the doctor, then Bryce. My voice didn't sound like my own. Words came out steady, mechanical, as if someone else were speaking for me. Bryce arrived that afternoon, suit pressed, expression rehearsed. He hugged me, briefly polite, detached, and went straight to the study to handle arrangements. Cora came the next day, tears perfectly timed. She placed a hand on my arm and whispered, "You must be strong, Elara. Daddy would want that." The funeral was simple, tasteful, and orchestrated to their liking. They chose the flowers, the hymns, the guests. I stood beside the casket, numb, listening to voices that didn't belong in our home. When the service ended, Bryce gave a short eulogy, then disappeared again into paperwork. Arthur's death didn't break me, not yet. It left me suspended, like a note held too long in the air. But grief has a way of changing shape when you realize it's not the only loss you're mourning. 3 weeks after the funeral, the mail arrived in a thick, cream-colored envelope stamped with Bryce's law firm logo. It was addressed not to Mrs. Elara Whitmore, but simply Elara Maeve. The absence of his father's name beside mine was the first insult. Inside was a single-page letter written in the kind of language designed to sound polite while cutting deep. Due to recent investment restructuring and trust realignment, your monthly allowance will be adjusted accordingly. The new figure was printed neatly below 70% less than before. I stared at it for several minutes before realizing I was holding my breath. Adjusted. Such a harmless word for what it really meant. I had gone from wife to widow, from widow to liability, all in less than a month. When I called Bryce for an explanation, his secretary answered, "Mr. Whitmore is in a meeting," she said. "He'll return your call when he's available." He never did. Cora sent a brief text later that evening. "Hope you received the notice. These things are complicated, Elara. We'll talk when things settle." But things didn't settle. They shifted decisively, and not in my favor. The house that had once felt safe now felt borrowed. I found myself whispering when I walked through the halls, as if asking permission to be there. The rooms were filled with memories, yet I'd never felt more homeless. That night, I sat in Arthur's armchair, clutching the letter until the paper softened from my grip. The moonlight slid across the rug, and I thought about how strange it was to spend a lifetime building a home, only to discover that it was never really yours. Grief had turned to something else, something colder. In the weeks that followed, I moved through the house like a visitor. Every room echoed differently. Arthur's chair stayed empty. The scent of his cologne lingered in the hall, faint but stubborn, like it refused to leave before I did. Bryce and Cora called once, maybe twice, each conversation shorter than the last. Their words were always courteous, but their tone carried a distance that felt deliberate. They spoke to me as though I were a tenant, someone temporary, someone tolerated. I kept the letter on the desk, unfolded, where I could see it each morning, not as a reminder of loss, but of clarity. The allowance they left me was enough to survive, but not to live. It was control, disguised as kindness, a leash they could pull without ever having to raise their voices. The realization didn't come with tears, it came with quiet. The kind of silence that settles when you stop expecting rescue. I began to understand that I wasn't part of the family anymore, at least not in their eyes. They had reduced me to an entry on a balance sheet, a minor cost that could be adjusted at will. That was the day I understood what it meant to be erased, not by death, but by choice. To be alive and still invisible. To walk through a home filled with your own memories and know that someone else is already planning where to place the furniture once you're gone. I looked around that night, and for the first time, I didn't see Arthur's house. I saw the battleground it would soon become. It was late afternoon when the phone rang. Cora's name flashed across the screen, something that hadn't happened since Arthur's funeral. For a brief second, I thought maybe she was calling to check on me, to bridge the distance between us. I answered, hopeful. Her voice was smooth, polite, and practiced. "Elara, I wanted to reach out personally," she began. "Bryce and I are finalizing the arrangements for the annual family cruise. We decided to go ahead this year, for the children's sake." I nodded even though she couldn't see me. "That's good. It'll be a nice way to honor Arthur's memory." "Yes," she said quickly. "But this year, we're keeping it small, just immediate family." I waited for her to explain, maybe to say my ticket would be sent later, or that the itinerary had changed. But the silence on the line stretched long enough for me to understand what she was really saying. She cleared her throat. "We're using the smaller suite this year, and we're bringing an assistant to help with the kids. You understand, don't you?" My stomach tightened. "Cora," I asked quietly, "am I not part of the plan?" There was a pause, one of those cold, deliberate pauses people use when they want to make sure the wound lands properly. "Oh, Elara," she said, voice dripping with sympathy she didn't feel. "This trip is really just for the family. It's nothing personal." Nothing personal. 2 words that can end a lifetime of civility. I managed to say goodbye without letting my voice break. When the call ended, I stared at the phone for a long while, as if expecting it to ring again for her to take it back. But it didn't. That silence was final. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I watered the plants Arthur and I had tended together, set the table for one, and tried convincing myself that maybe Cora was right, maybe they just needed space to grieve differently. But the universe doesn't let you hold on to comforting lies for long. Around noon, my phone buzzed, a message from Bryce. It was short, only 12 words. "You're not family, Elara. You can't come on our cruise. Please understand." No greeting, no apology. Just a final verdict, delivered through pixels. I read it once, then twice, then again. By the 3rd time, the words started to blur, but the meaning stayed sharp. The son I'd cooked for, prayed for, defended in Arthur's absence had just defined family in a way that erased me entirely. I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I sat down slowly, as if the air had thickened around me. My phone slipped from my hand and landed softly on the rug, screen still glowing. That was how betrayal sounded in the modern world, silent, digital, and polite. Most people think betrayal looks obvious, but it doesn't. It starts with small exclusions, quiet phone calls, and accidental silences. Subscribe before the next betrayal story hits closer to your home. And if you won't, comment why. I'm curious who's brave enough to ignore the warning. That night, I stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker across the driveway. The family car sat where Arthur used to park it, empty, waiting. The same vehicle I'd ridden in for a decade would now carry them to the port without me. It wasn't the trip that hurt. It was the message underneath it. I was no longer wanted. And yet, deep in the quiet, a thought began to take shape, something calm, deliberate, and far stronger than sadness. The morning after Bryce's message, I brewed my coffee as usual. Same cup, same kitchen. But nothing about the silence felt the same. Every sound, the kettle's whistle, the clock's steady rhythm, seemed to count down to something I couldn't yet name. When I looked at my reflection in the window, I didn't see the woman who used to wait for approval or affection. I saw someone who'd been erased and had survived it. For years, I had believed in patience, in kindness, in the quiet dignity Arthur admired. But kindness, I realized, was only respected until it became inconvenient. That text didn't just exclude me from a trip, it stripped away the last illusion that I still belonged. And once you stop belonging, you stop asking for permission. I folded the phone shut, slid it into a drawer, and walked through the house one more time. Every photo, every memory, every sound of that family's laughter in the walls, they all became fuel. People talk about revenge like it's chaos. But mine would be order. Measured, inevitable. I sat down at Arthur's old desk, opened the drawer where he kept his pens, and whispered, "You'd understand, wouldn't you?" The house didn't answer. It didn't need to. If this happened to your mother or grandmother, would you stay silent or fight back? Tell me below. Then, with a calm I didn't recognize in myself, I said the words that would carry me through every step that followed. That was the moment I stopped being their victim. I became their reckoning. Revenge doesn't start with rage, it starts with quiet. The kind of quiet that lets you think clearly. That's where I was sitting in Arthur's study days after the text, surrounded by the faint scent of his cologne and the faint hum of the ceiling fan. The shock had passed. So had the tears. What was left wasn't grief, it was focus. I pulled out his old planner, the one he never let anyone touch. The pages were filled with neat, cursive numbers, reminders, a lifetime of small order. I traced my finger across the lines, realizing how much I'd missed while trying to be a good wife instead of a curious one. Bryce had always managed Arthur's finances, but Arthur wasn't careless. He was deliberate, old-fashioned, but never naive. Somewhere, he would have left something, some protection I hadn't yet seen. The trick was finding it. I started with the obvious: his desk drawers, filing cabinets, the small safe in the hallway closet. Every paper was exactly what it seemed: account statements, medical bills, correspondence. Nothing that hinted at hidden leverage. By nightfall, I'd made piles on the floor. Old checks, faded receipts, even letters from when we first met. Nothing useful yet, none of it felt pointless either. I found comfort in the process itself. Searching was control. Control was power. And after months of being spoken over, excluded, and reduced, power was something I intended to reclaim piece by piece, document by document. Somewhere in that house was the key to everything Bryce had stolen. I could feel it close enough to touch, but just out of reach. Arthur had a saying: "If you know where a man hides his pride, you'll know where he hides his secrets." That line replayed in my mind as I searched through his belongings, not for documents, but for meaning. Arthur was sentimental, but not careless. Every object in that house carried a story, and I started treating them like clues instead of memories. His bookshelves were arranged by color, not author, something I'd always found strange. The blues came first: financial manuals, old ledgers, company histories. Then came the Browns' classic novels, all worn at the spine. I ran my hand along the shelf until my fingers stopped at The Old Man and the Sea. Arthur had loved that story. "A man's worth is proven when the world takes everything and he keeps rowing," he once told me. I opened the book. Inside, pressed between two yellowing pages, was a small photograph: Arthur standing beside a 1967 Shelby GT 500, smiling like a boy. On the back of the photo was a note, written in his handwriting. "She's worth more than they think." My pulse quickened. Arthur hadn't driven that car in years. Bryce had always called it Dad's antique money pit, but Arthur had refused to sell it, said it wasn't about the car, it was about what it represented. I suddenly remembered a night, months before his passing, when he'd said something odd at dinner. "Elara, if they ever make you feel small, remember I've already taken care of you in a way they'll never understand." At the time, I'd smiled, thinking it was sentiment. Now, I wasn't so sure. That memory, the photograph, the car, they didn't feel random anymore. They felt like instructions. I began checking every place Arthur might have hidden something of value. The old tool chest in the garage, his desk drawers, even the hollow compartment behind the grandfather clock. Nothing. By the third day, exhaustion gave way to irritation. I had turned the house inside out and still, nothing that explained the photograph or his cryptic words. That evening, as I was dusting the vanity in our bedroom, my hand brushed against Arthur's jewelry box, a small mahogany case lined with crimson velvet. He used to keep his cufflinks there, the ones he wore to board meetings and Sunday service. I opened it, half expecting to find the usual trinkets, but something felt different. The lining seemed uneven, slightly raised at the corner. I pressed it gently. It shifted. My breath caught. Slowly, I peeled back the velvet layer, revealing a folded envelope wedged beneath. Inside was a single page, Arthur's handwriting again, steady and deliberate. "Elara, if you've found this, it means you've been patient. What's enclosed belongs only to you. Keep it safe, and remember, some legacies are meant to be hidden until the right moment." Attached was a sealed document labeled codicil. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, eyes scanning the words. Arthur had left me full ownership of the 1967 Shelby GT 500, including all proceeds from its sale, free from trust interference. That car wasn't just sentimental. It was leverage worth hundreds of thousands, and legally untouchable by Bryce. The final line read, "It's worth more than any cruise." For the first time in months, I felt something powerful, not anger, not grief. Clarity. Until I lifted the velvet lining of a jewelry box and saw my salvation. Arthur's handwriting had always fascinated me, strong, deliberate, and slightly slanted, like a man leaning into his words. Even after death, his script carried the calm authority I'd always trusted. I spread the codicil across the desk, running my fingers over the embossed paper. The pen strokes felt familiar, alive. Every letter looked intentional, not the trembling effort of a sick man, but the confident motion of someone leaving behind a message, not a memory. The language was simple but powerful. To my wife, Elara Whitmore, I leave the full ownership of the 1967 Shelby GT 500 and all rights therein. This codicil is to supersede prior agreements under any existing trust. It wasn't just property, it was freedom, written in legal ink. For months, I had been stripped of everything that defined my security. Now, here it was, a single page that restored it all. Arthur hadn't died defeated, he had planned ahead. I sat there for a long while, reading the letter again and again. He hadn't written apologies. He didn't need to. His love spoke through foresight. Next to the codicil was his note, short, barely 8 words. "It's worth more than any cruise." The words hit differently now. It wasn't just a jab at Bryce and Cora's petty vacation. It was Arthur's way of saying, "You will rise higher than they ever sail." My tears came quietly. Not from sadness, from gratitude. He couldn't protect me in life, so he armed me for after. That was his last act of love, not flowers, not promises, but strategy. The next morning, I drove to the old storage facility on the edge of Savannah, the one Arthur used to visit on Saturdays, under the pretense of checking the tires. He had always said it was just a hobby, a sentimental keepsake, but standing there now, key in hand, I felt the truth waiting behind the corrugated door. When I lifted the latch, the smell of motor oil and leather filled the air, faint, but still loyal. And there she was. The Shelby GT 500 sat beneath a canvas cover, her form unmistakable even through the dust. I pulled the sheet away slowly, revealing the deep cobalt blue paint and silver racing stripes that caught what little light filtered in. Arthur's pride, his secret, and now, my inheritance. The chrome glinted softly, and for a moment, I could almost see him, sleeves rolled up, humming under his breath while polishing the hood. He'd once told me, "You don't keep a car like this for the road, you keep it for what it reminds you of freedom." I opened the driver's door. The leather seat sighed softly beneath my hand. Inside the glove compartment, I found a folded invoice from 1972, marked Private Collector Model 1, of 27 produced. A rare edition. Arthur had never mentioned that. Attached to it was a small note in his handwriting, faded but legible. "If you're reading this, Elara, it means you've finally learned to stop asking permission." I closed my eyes and smiled through the sting of tears. Bryce had spent his life calculating value in dollars. Arthur measured it in meaning. He didn't just leave me a car. He left me a message, a reminder that love isn't proven through protection, but through preparation. The Shelby was more than a machine. It was Arthur's final argument, his rebuttal to every insult, every exclusion, every whispered remark about family. And in that dim storage unit, surrounded by dust and silence, I made a vow. Their wealth came from deceit. Mine would come from justice. That night, I sat at Arthur's old desk again, the codicil laid beside a steaming cup of tea. It was strange the paper looked so ordinary. Yet within those few paragraphs was enough leverage to undo everything Bryce thought he'd secured. The Shelby wasn't just valuable, it was independent of the trust. Meaning, he couldn't touch it, couldn't contest it, couldn't even delay the process without exposing his manipulation. For the first time since Arthur's death, I had something he didn't. I spent the evening drafting notes, listing names, tracing connections. Arthur's old accountant, Walter Reed, had retired years ago, but I remembered the kindness in his eyes and the quiet way he used to double-check Bryce's numbers when Arthur wasn't looking. If anyone could help me navigate this legally, discreetly, it was him. My revenge wouldn't be loud or reckless. It would be structured, deliberate, and completely lawful. I wasn't going to scream at the gates of injustice. I was going to open them from the inside. As I sealed the codicil back into its envelope, a calm settled over me, the kind of calm you feel before a storm you no longer fear. Arthur had given me more than wealth. He'd given me strategy. And through that, he'd given me purpose. I whispered into the quiet room. "You built the plan, Arthur. I'll finish it." The Shelby would be the first move, but it wouldn't be the last. I turned off the desk lamp, letting the soft darkness reclaim the study. The faint smell of Arthur's cologne lingered in the air, steady, reassuring. This wasn't grief anymore. It was execution. 2 days after discovering the codicil, I met Walter Reed at a quiet cafe near the river. He looked older, slower, but his mind was still sharp. His handshake was steady, his expression unreadable. When I slid the envelope across the table, he adjusted his glasses and began to read. The longer his eyes moved across the page, the more his brow lifted, part surprise, part admiration. "Well," he said at last, folding the paper neatly. Arthur was smarter than anyone gave him credit for. "Can it hold up?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "It's airtight. Bryce can't challenge this without exposing his own conflict of interest. Once you sell the car, the funds are yours, fully protected." I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Walter leaned closer. "If you want this done quietly, I know a collector who's been hunting for this model for years. He'll pay top dollar, and we'll move it under a private contract." His precision impressed me. No loose ends, no noise. For the first time, I was the one in control of a transaction Bryce didn't even know existed. That night, Walter called to confirm. The buyer had agreed to meet his courier at my property before dawn. The following Tuesday, the same morning, Bryce and Cora would be boarding their cruise. The timing was poetic. As I hung up, I couldn't help but think, Arthur didn't just leave me a gift, he left me a map. And I was following it exactly as he intended. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about destruction. It was about restoration, one signature at a time. Tuesday arrived before the Sunday. The air was cool, the kind that carries both calm and anticipation. I'd barely slept. Instead, I spent the night going over every detail, the contract Walter prepared, the vehicle title, the codicil copies sealed in their envelope. Everything was aligned. At exactly 6:30 a.m., headlights glowed down the driveway. The courier's truck rolled to a stop, engine humming low. A man stepped out, clipboard in hand, his demeanor brisk and professional. "Mrs. Whitmore?" "Yes. I'm here for the Shelby GT 500. Transfer and inspection only. Payment confirmation will be sent within the hour." I nodded, unlocking the storage door. When he saw the car, his expression changed. "They don't make them like this anymore," he murmured. He performed a quick verification, cross-checking the VIN against Walter's documents. Then, with delicate precision, he eased the Shelby onto the transport ramp. The metal groaned softly beneath the tires. Every movement felt heavy with meaning. As the truck door closed, I looked at the car one last time. The blue paint caught the first streak of sunlight, glimmering like a farewell. Walter called, right on cue. "It's done," he said. "Funds are processing now. You'll have confirmation within the hour." I thanked him quietly. Across town, Bryce and Cora were boarding the cruise ship, smiling, laughing, unaware that their inheritance had already changed hands. While they toasted to their victory, I stood at the window, watching the courier truck disappear down the street. For the first time in months, I didn't feel small. I felt steady, grounded. Stories like this prove one thing: quiet women carry the loudest power. Subscribe before the next twist catches you off guard. The car that symbolized their future now paid for mine. I closed the blinds, made myself tea, and waited for Walter's second call, the one that would confirm everything. By noon, Walter's second call came. "Transaction cleared," he said. "Funds transferred in full." I thanked him, my voice steady, the kind of steadiness that only comes when justice has already spoken. When I hung up, I didn't celebrate. I didn't pour a drink or smile. I simply stood by the window, watching the empty driveway. The courier truck was gone. So was the car. And with it, every ounce of power Bryce thought he owned. Some victories aren't loud. They're quiet, like the sound of a door closing for the last time on someone who never thought you'd walk away. I brewed another cup of tea and sat on the porch, the Savannah breeze brushing past my hair. Across the water, the distant hum of ship horns carried faintly. I imagined Bryce and Cora raising their glasses on that cruise, blissfully unaware that their celebration was already built on air. The car that symbolized their future now paid for mine. Every time someone like Elara rises, another story like hers gets buried, silenced by greed and power. Don't be the one left unaware when it happens again. Subscribe now, and if you still won't, step into the comments and tell me why you'd rather stay in the dark. I leaned back in the chair, the codicil resting in my lap. Arthur's handwriting stared back at me like a promise kept. He hadn't just loved me. He'd trusted me to finish what he started. And I had. For the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. 3 days later, the phone began to ring again. The first call came mid-morning. Bryce's name flashed across the screen, followed by 3 more attempts in less than an hour. Then Cora tried. Her message was short, frantic, and strangely polite. "Elara, please call us back. Something's happened with Dad's car. We need to talk." I didn't answer. By evening, the messages turned desperate. Bryce's voice, once so sure and commanding, now carried a tremor I'd never heard before. "You can't just sell it. That car was part of the trust. I'll have this reversed, you hear me?" But he couldn't. He didn't even realize that the very document that granted him control over Arthur's estate had excluded the Shelby entirely. Arthur had built the trap, and Bryce had walked into it without looking down. By the next day, Walter forwarded me an email from Bryce's office, full of legal confusion and frantic inquiries about missing assets and private transfers. I didn't need to read every line. The subject said enough. Urgent, Shelby GT 500 ownership discrepancy. I smiled faintly, then closed the laptop. While they argued on a cruise ship deck, surrounded by champagne and false comfort, I sat on my porch with a cup of chamomile tea, the Savannah air soft against my face. Justice didn't roar. It whispered. And I listened to every note. That evening, the sky turned amber, the kind of color Arthur used to call peace weather. I sat outside with my tea, watching the light fade across the porch railing. The world didn't look any different, but I was. The house, once filled with echoes of dismissal, now breathed quietly around me. Every clock tick, every creak in the floorboards felt like it belonged again. For months, I had waited for an apology that would never come. Now, I didn't need one. Bryce and Cora would return from their cruise eventually, but by then, the car would be gone, the payment finalized, and the truth settled in the form of legal permanence. No shouting match, no courtroom scene, just silence that said more than words ever could. Justice, I realized, isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about removing access, denying the very people who thought they could define you the chance to ever speak over you again. I leaned back, feeling the wood of the chair press gently against my shoulders. For the first time since Arthur's passing, I felt safe, not because someone protected me, but because I had learned to protect myself. The phone buzzed again. Bryce, one more time. I let it ring until it stopped. There's a unique kind of peace that comes from not answering. I whispered softly to the quiet evening air. Sometimes justice isn't loud, it's in the silence of not needing to explain yourself. The wind carried those words through the porch, rustling the nearby oak leaves like an acknowledgement. Arthur would have understood. He'd always known I had it in me. I just needed to be pushed far enough to find it. When morning came, sunlight filled the house like an old friend. I walked through the halls slowly, letting the warmth settle on the framed photos that lined the walls. Arthur at the lake, our wedding picture, the faded image of him standing beside the Shelby. For months, those photos had been reminders of what I'd lost. Now, they were proof of what I'd reclaimed. I brewed one final cup of tea, carried it out to the porch, and set it beside me as I watched the horizon. Across town, life carried on, neighbors walking dogs, distant laughter from a passing jogger. It all felt ordinary again. And yet, in that ordinariness, I found grace. Arthur once told me that love isn't about the grand gestures, it's about what remains when the noise fades. He was right. He couldn't protect me in life, but through his final act, he taught me how to protect myself, not through confrontation, but through certainty. The kind of certainty that doesn't need to announce itself. When people spoke of Arthur's legacy, they'd remember his company, his cars, his estate. But I'd remember something else entirely, the quiet wisdom of a man who trusted me enough to finish his story with strength instead of sorrow. I smiled faintly, raising the teacup in a silent toast to the air. To love. To lessons. To justice that never needed an audience. In the end, what I learned wasn't about revenge. It was about return, the slow, deliberate return to myself. For months, I thought justice meant retaliation. But real justice, it isn't fire. It's stillness. It's the moment you stop explaining your worth to people who only measure it in what they can take from you. I once believed family was built through marriage, through shared holidays and polite dinners. Now I know better. Family isn't blood, it's loyalty. Loyalty is what keeps promises long after the people who made them are gone. It's what Arthur left me in the form of a car, a letter, and a choice to rise quietly or crumble loudly. I chose the quiet path. Not because it was easy, but because silence holds power when the truth stands on its own. Every document Bryce forged, every word Cora whispered behind my back, they became the bricks of the fortress I built inside myself. Not hatred, not vengeance, just certainty. If there's one thing I hope others learn from this, it's that cruelty doesn't always come with shouting. Sometimes it arrives wearing a smile. And sometimes the only way to fight it is to stop waiting for fairness and start becoming your own protection. Arthur used to say, "We can't control what people do to us, but we can control what story we let it become." He was right. Because this peace, this victory became mine. When I look back now, I don't see a battle. I see a lesson written in loss, signed in courage. They said I wasn't family. But family isn't blood, it's loyalty. Arthur proved that loyalty doesn't end with life. It continues in the choices we make after someone's gone, choices that honor their memory, not their mistakes. Bryce and Cora taught me something too, though not in the way they intended. They showed me that greed always thinks it's clever, right up until it trips over its own confidence. I didn't ruin them. I didn't have to. They did that the moment they mistook kindness for weakness. Sometimes, revenge isn't destruction. It's reclamation, the act of taking back what was stolen, not through force, but through wisdom. I used to think silence meant defeat. Now I know silence can be victory because true power doesn't announce itself, it simply exists. The house, the memories, the tea on the porch, they're all part of the same piece I once thought I'd never find. Arthur's spirit lingers here, not in sadness, but in completion. And if he could see me now, I think he'd smile the same soft smile he wore when he polished that car for the last time. Because in the end, I didn't just protect his legacy. I became it. We've all seen greed tear families apart, but few have seen justice this poetic. Comment, "Justice served," if you agree, and don't forget to join us for the next story of her revenge.